Hello and welcome back to our Emotional Health webinar series brought to you by the SAT-B2 Gene Foundation. I'm joined again by Shepard, who's a licensed professional counselor that specializes in helping couples and also people on difficult parenting journeys. Today's topic focuses on conversations we need to have to help keep our relationships strong.
Thanks so much. I am so excited to be back with y'all today. We're going to keep talking about relationships. And so in the first part of the webinar, we talked a lot about some of the real practical stuff. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the conversations that we want to be having as couples to help us stay connected as we go through this really hard journey, right? So one of the first things that we think about is this idea, we can really manage anything that's thrown at us, but we've got to stay on the same team and we've got to keep talking. And this is a hard thing. It's harder than a lot of people realize. I kind of think about, there was one point when we were in a really big crisis with my daughter's health, and it kept going on and on and on. And at this point, I'm in grad school, and there was this one particular student in my cohort that was really just not a very kind person. And she would do stuff at school that was just really off color. And in the normal world, I would come home and I would have said, oh my goodness, she did this today. You would not imagine how rude she was or whatever. But what I noticed is that I would come home and I would sit down at the dinner table and I would just get really quiet because it would feel really stupid to have a kid that I didn't know if she was going to survive and all the chaos at the kids' schools around that and the other kids struggling and to talk about the mean girl at school. And that just felt really dumb. And so I kind of stopped talking. And it got to the place where it felt like the only thing we could talk about was this disability, was this crisis. Which isn't a really healthy spot for a relationship because it's not the only thing in our world, even when it's really, really big. And so what my husband and I ended up doing is we decided we were going to go on a date and we were not going to allow epilepsy on our date. And at first it was really, really awkward. And then we kind of finally started talking and all of a sudden it was this, right? All the things that we hadn't been able to talk about, finally we could say, and we were able to really reconnect. And so we still do this. We recently had a really hard appointment with one of my daughter's doctors, and we were supposed to be going on a big date that night. And it's like, okay, we're going to sit down, we're going to talk through this appointment, get that settled, and then it's not coming with us so that we have space for both, right? So we want to really purposely set that time aside where we're doing both. For a lot of couples, people tend to go one of two ways. Either the only thing they want to talk about is the disability, is the challenge that we're facing, or they don't want to talk about it at all. And what we find is that in a lot of couples, we have one of each. So we've got one person who's like, we have to talk about this, we have to figure this out. And the other one's like, I don't want to talk, let's just shut down, kind of take that ostrich approach. And it causes a lot of conflict in the relationship. And so what typically works is we want to schedule both in that kind of a space. We want to schedule the conversation about the disability first. So we're going to set a time. We're going to say at this point, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk through it. Now we're also going to schedule a time for it to end. So that person who really struggles to show up for that conversation is going to know going into it that I'm right. And so we're going to schedule that one first. We're going to address the disability. We're going to address whatever the crisis is, whether it's health or school or whatever. We're going to go to that. And then we're going to come back and we're going to have time where the disability is off the table, right? That we're allowed to talk about anything else, everything else, so that we're able to really reconnect. And most of the time, once we've done this for a little while, then we're kind of able to bounce in and out between the different conversations. which is where we really want to go to. That we can talk about all of it. But especially if we're in that space where it's either taking up all of the room, or it's this elephant in the room that we're all trying to ignore, we want to schedule space for both. Sometimes when we're very first starting this, it can feel really awkward trying to talk, especially if we're coming out of a really hard, or even if we're in the middle of a really hard season. Trying to talk about anything else can get really tricky. It just feels awkward. It doesn't feel like this other stuff is nearly as important. And so one of the resources that can be helpful for that, there's a free app. It's called the Gottman Card Decks. It's called that because it originally was some physical card decks. But on this, they've got different questions that you can use. There's one that's called open-ended questions. And so you can pull that up and you just flip through and ask each other some questions and get that conversation started. Now there's one on there that's called love maps. Don't do that. It'll only cause a fight. But start with that open-ended question with, and just kind of let the conversation get flowing. And that can be a really great resource. Now for a lot of people, there's this idea that talking doesn't help. And so there can be some resistance to this idea, like, why do we have to talk about this? This is stupid. It won't change anything. And in some ways, you're absolutely right. In some ways, talking about it does not change. You're still going to have the same diagnosis. You're still going to have the same obstacles. And also, talking does help, right? What we know is that when we're able to talk through it, when we feel like we're really being heard by our person, then that helps our brains get out of that survival mode. It helps us physically handle more pain. It helps us think more creatively and figure stuff out. Being with each other in that way makes a difference. There's this one study, it's so cool. They take women and they put them in an fMRI machine and they shock their ankles. And so they'll have these little lights that shine, and when the light starts blinking, you're about to get shocked. And they look at their brains, and unsurprisingly, when the light starts to blink, you feel fear. And when you get shocked, you feel pain. That's kind of what we would expect, right? But then they do the same experiment, but they have the women's person come in there and hold their hand. And if your person is holding your hand, then the parts of your brain that show fear don't light up in the same way. And when they rate that pain from that same exact shock, it doesn't hurt as much. Our brains, when we feel like our person is with us and is talking to us and is on our side, our brains feel like we're better able to handle the threat in a very physical way. So when you show up and you have those conversations with your person, you're physically helping their brain manage this crisis. It is absolutely making a difference, and it's doing something, even if it's not fixing the root of the issue, even if it's not changing the thing that you're facing. Okay. When we're having conversations, we kind of want to go into it with some ground rules. So we have these things, we call them the 4 horsemen of the marriage apocalypse, because as therapists can be a little dramatic sometimes. But these things, when they show up in marriage, they predict divorce better than affairs do. We can come back from betrayal. When the 4 horsemen get in there and then they stay, that really does some damage. And so those horsemen are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Now, stonewalling is when from the outside it looks like you just completely shut down. What we know is that most of the time it's pure chaos inside. Your heart is racing, your thoughts are going wild, but it feels like there's nothing I can say that's going to make this any better, so I'm just going to shut down and try to not make it worse, right? And typically what happens is it kind of goes in this cycle, and we talked some about cycles in the last one. But first there's criticism, and then the other person gets defensive, and then that criticism morphs into contempt, and then that defensiveness isn't working, and so we go into stonewalling. But we want to really watch for those pieces, and when we see them coming up, we want to kind of try to pause and do something a little bit different, because we know how much of an impact they have on our relationships. When when we're in this space where when we're first learning to talk through it, you know, a lot of times we get really angry about how each other are responding, about what we're facing. But we want to go in with the ground rule that attacking character is off limits. So I can be really mad at what you've done, but that's different than being angry at who you are, right? So I'm not going to come in and say things like, you are a bad parent, or you don't love them, or you're a bad human, or curse words at, you know, as far as like curse words about who they are, right? If you throw some cuss words in there because you're mad, whatever, but we're not going to attack their character. Okay, that's an off limits kind of space, because all that does is that puts people in that really defensive space, or that stonewalling space, and it shuts down the conversation. So we're going to remember that our people are good people. There's a reason that we're with them. And also we're going to work through the issues. We want to come in and we want to figure out how we're talking about the actions that we need to talk about, but we're doing that from a space of love. And that might mean that we have to really sit down and figure out, how do I approach this? Maybe we can't do it just off the cuff, but we come at it from this place. I love you and we need to fix this. I love you and we need to talk about this because I'm really struggling here. One of the things we want to do as we start talking is we want to start talking about the triggers that we have and making plans to manage them together. And so, you know, we kind of start slow, but we start letting each other know, hey, you know what? This is a piece that's really, really hard for me. And how do we manage this? So for me, I was in the Walmart parking lot when I got my daughter's diagnosis. We were scheduled for surgery, and the neurologist called me, and I was standing in the parking lot, and she said, surgery's off. She has this genetic disorder. She's going to basically seize until she dies. And all of that happened in my same spot where I had parked at Walmart for years and years and years. And so for me, I can't park in that spot anymore. And that's okay. I can park in a different spot. Now, I can avoid that trigger. Now, if I couldn't go to Walmart at all, that would probably be something I needed to work on. But I can park the next aisle over. And I did this for a couple of years before my husband figured out that, before I finally told my husband that I really didn't like it when he parked in my old spot. And because he loves me, as soon as he figured that out, he immediately makes this adjustment. And if we go to Walmart together, he parks in the other spot, right? Because that's what we do. We manage each other's stuff. Now, there's sometimes with triggers that it doesn't make sense to avoid them. For most parents of kids who struggle, hospitals are a big trigger, right? It might even be for you that maybe even driving past the hospital, maybe you see the exit to the hospital, or you see an ambulance, and all of that makes your entire nervous system go wild. So we might not be able, and we realistically aren't able, to avoid the trigger of hospital. Maybe you can change the way you drive home so you don't have to pass it. But we can't say, you know what, my kid's in crisis, but going to the hospital triggers me. I can't do that. That's not a realistic option. So in those spaces, those are things that we have to figure out, okay, is there a piece that I can adjust, or do I just need support coping with this? And how does that look? And so then we have this conversation that says, okay, this is really hard for me. I need you to hold my hand while we walk in. I need to bring this thing in here with me so that I know I'm going to be okay, right? And we really talk through what are those triggers that we can't avoid and how do we manage them together. And something really magical happens when we know that our person is going to help us manage them. A lot of times that takes some of the fire out. If I know that I'm not going in there alone, if I know that you're on my side, then I feel empowered that I can handle it more, right? And so we're going to start talking about that. Here's the things that really, really get it for me. And let's talk through, can we avoid it? Do we adjust for it? Do I need support coping with it? And how do we do that together? Okay. We also want to start learning and guarding these things that we call raw spots. Now, everybody has raw spots. So I like to think about it. When I had my thyroid taken out, they did some kind of nerve damage. So I can't wear chunky necklaces anymore. I have a bathroom full of chunky necklaces, but if I put on a chunky necklace, it just hurts. So for me, it's a raw spot. If I can't wear them anymore, right? It just getting bumped up there hurts. Everybody has raw spots from past relationships, from this relationship, from parenting, that when those things get bumped up against, they hurt more than it would hurt a typical person. And when we learn those for each other, then we can start guarding them, right? If I know that my person has something in their past that really, really stings, I'm never going to bring that up in an argument. I'm going to guard it. I will never use that against them. And then I'm going to notice, you know what, if I do this, that bumps that. Or if I hear somebody else say that, I'm going to recognize the impact for them. We had a doctor's appointment where my doctor told me I would be lucky if my daughter lived to be 18. And I passionately hate the word lucky now. That's a raw spot for me. And I can recognize that for 99.9% of the population, being called lucky doesn't do anything for them. They can use that word and it's completely fine. But my husband's going to recognize he's not going to call me lucky. And if he hears somebody else call me lucky, he's going to know, oh, that just stung her. And so, if it gets big enough, he might step in. Otherwise, he's going to kind of give me that look that says, I know it just happened there. And that recognition and that look, that right there, a lot of times is enough to help us calm each other's nervous systems down, right? It is just about being on each other's side and helping guard and protect those raw spots. So I want to think about some of the conversations that we want to be having. And I kind of have these split. So we want to have some conversations with ourselves, with our partners, and then with our partners about parenting. So we can kind of start with the things that we want to do reflectively in ourselves. And we want to think about, what did I learn about relationships and connection growing up? What did it look like? What did I expect? What did I dream about? But how did I think a healthy relationship was supposed to look? In the last webinar, we talked about that pursuer withdrawer spectrum. And we want to think about, where do I fit on that? With the recognition that there's not a wrong spot to be. They just are. These are the ways that we learn to connect with our people from the time we were itty bitty babies. And so they just are. And I want to be able to recognize where I show up. One of the things that we also want to think about is, am I really proud of how I show up in my relationship? When are the times that I feel like a wife rock star? When are the times that I think I'm doing very good and I'm proud of myself? And the times that I'm not? And how do I change so that I can be really proud of myself? And I think it's really helpful also to very, very purposely, especially when things are hard, to kind of start thinking about, what do I love most about my person? What have I felt most connected to that? This can also be a really helpful thing when you're really struggling with your kiddos, is to kind of do that focus. We're not ignoring the bad stuff, the hard stuff, but we're just also bringing in that, hey, you know what? Here's the thing that I adore about you. Here's the one moment from today that went really well, that I felt good with you. Okay? And we start really purposely bringing that in to kind of help us get some balance. Otherwise, those negative thoughts can get super, super loud, and we want to bring in some of the positive just to get balance. And then we want to start thinking about those conversations with our person. Now, you don't want to have, don't screenshot this and try to have every single conversation tonight. This is a process. A great relationship is just a conversation that goes on forever. Okay, so we're going to kind of take it slow. But one of the first things we can talk about is, what does our cycle look like? Where are we getting stuck? Right? And then we're going to have some of those conversations that we did on our own with our person. What did you learn about connection growing up? How did you get comfort growing up? When you were having a hard time, who did you go to And how did they comfort you? Because that's going to show me how I can comfort you. Like, what are the things that you recognize as, if somebody loves me, they do this, right? Those are things we really want to know about our people. What are those raw spots for you in the relationship and parenting, right? When are you feeling most connected to me? When are things just really clicking for you? And we're not going to be surprised at all if they look completely different for each person, right? That's 100% expected. You're going to have moments when you're like, this was the most important moment of our entire relationship. It was gorgeous. It was beautiful. And your person's going to be like, I don't remember that, right? And that's totally normal because we each come in with different perspectives. We're going to ask, what do you want our relationship in our family to look like? What would healthy be like in your world? And what are some of the changes that would make a difference in how connected you feel, right? And so none of this is about judgment. It's really not at this point even about like negotiating it, but it's just really getting curious. And how do I show up for my person in a way that they're going to feel connected, that they're going to feel heard, and we pull that connection even closer. And then we want to start having some conversations about parenting. One of the most important conversations we can have is asking each other, what did you dream about parenting before you had kids? And here's the thing about this. Nobody's dream comes true exactly. But there is a difference between somebody who dreamed of having a football star and gets a chess player instead, and somebody who dreams of having a football star and their kid has a major disability. There's a difference there. And it's important that we recognize that difference, that there's parts of our dreams that don't come true, that the disability gets in the way of, and we have to grieve that. We absolutely adore and love our kids. We're not grieving our child. We're just grieving the loss of that dream. And it's going to look different for each of you. There's probably some really specific moments that you thought about as being like the pinnacle of parenting. Right? Maybe it was throwing the football in the backyard. Maybe it was getting her dressed for her first dance. Maybe it was them winning the spelling bee. Right? But whatever it was, we want to get really clear about what's that dream. Is that a dream that can't happen now? Is that a dream we need to grieve, that we need to adjust? Is it something that we need to make sure comes true, right? That we allow some space for. And so we just kind of build that in, but we want to have those dreams. And that can feel like a really vulnerable conversation. So it's okay if we wait until we're in a space where we're feeling kind of connected. But that's a really important conversation for couples to have. We want to talk about what's the hardest part of parenting, or this diagnosis, or the trauma that we've gone through for you. Again, it's going to be different for each of you. So we want to get real clear, what's this really hard piece for you and what happens for you? And we kind of lead in from there. Okay, are you having trauma symptoms around it? Are you having nightmares? Are you having flashbacks? Are you having big anxiety that makes it really hard to function? All of those things are really common in this world. There's a large percentage of parents that end up with symptoms of PTSD. There's a lot of parents that get big depression, big anxiety going through this. And a lot of times people don't tell each other that. It very often comes as a surprise. And so we want to open up that conversation, because that lets us get help, right? It lets us join each other in it. When is this parenting journey the hardest for you? Right? What's that piece? And also, when do you feel best about your parenting? When are you like, I'm a rock star, this is going great, this is my favorite thing about this? Because I want to make sure that you're getting support in that too, that you get the chance to do the things that just make things really click for you. And then we're going to have this conversation. How do I know when you need help? Can you tell me? Do I need to notice something? Like, do you have routines that anybody who knew what that routine meant would say, oh, this is what just happened? So for instance, My daughter would have these seizure clusters where she would have a seizure in the middle of the night about every hour. And so on my way to work in the morning after this, if we had a seizure night, then instead of getting one drink from Starbucks, I would usually get 2 drinks from Starbucks, right? Because I would know I've had 3 minutes of sleep and I'm going to be tired today, so I need to eat and coffee. And so if you knew that about me, and you saw me walk into my office with 2 drinks in my hand, you would be like, oh, they had a seizure night last night, right? We want to kind of figure that stuff out with our person. Oh, you're doing this. You're listening to that song. You're spending more time out there, right? A lot of times there's these little pieces that we do to cope, and we want to recognize that that's what those are. Those are coping skills. And how do I support you? How do I recognize that that's something that means maybe you're having a hard time, right? The truth is, again, we can manage just about anything that's thrown at us. We've got to keep talking. We've got to stay on the same team. We want to be having these conversations so that we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that they're with me and that we're going to get through this together. As we're doing this, we want to give each other just tons and tons of grace. We want to recognize that nobody's going to do this right, especially in the beginning. It's going to be messy. We don't have a script for it. We're trying to figure it out. And so we're going to give each other grace after grace after grace. They're trying, they love me, they love our kid. We're just getting this figured out. And then we're going to be willing to ask for help when we need it. Now, one of the important pieces as we're talking about these conversations, though, is that I don't want you to turn off this webinar and get emotionally negative. Don't do that, right? There's a reason we keep our armor on. There's a reason we keep ourselves guarded. And if we try to shove all of these conversations into an hour and just immediately bare our souls, and we don't have the safety for that yet, it's like we're having an emotional one-night stand. And afterwards, you walk away from it. Brene Brown calls it a vulnerability hangover. But you walk away from it and you feel like, oh my God, I can't believe I shared that much. I feel so much shame. I feel so awful. And it ends up pulling us farther and farther into ourselves or away from each other. So we want to do this slow, especially if we're coming from a rough space. We start with some of that shallow stuff. We start with some of those smaller conversations, maybe that Gottman card app, but we just start doing whatever we can to start talking. And then we keep talking and we build those deeper and deeper conversations so that we can bear all to each other, so that we can get as deep as we want to get with each other. But we don't want to just jump into it and get emotionally naked today. Okay. Now, for a lot of people, sometimes it does mean we need to get some help, and that's okay. There's a lot of people that go to couples counseling or individual counseling. We want to get help before it gets super bad. We don't want to wait until we're calling divorce lawyers. So some of the signs that you might need to talk to a couples counselor or another professional counselor is if there's any kind of abuse, if you're not feeling safe, especially physically. If either partner is having thoughts of harming themselves, harming anybody else. Again, y'all, this is so common. It does not have to stay this hard, but if you are having these thoughts, you are far from the only one. This is a major part of this journey, and it just means that we need to get some help so we can learn how to cope with it. If you're noticing that you're spending most of your time together caught in that negative cycle, if we're getting in arguments where we're getting, those 4 horsemen are showing up, or we're causing some wounds in those arguments, especially emotionally. If you're struggling to be able to talk about the challenges or connect, or if you get to that space where you're like, I'm just too tired to fight anymore. I just don't even have it in me. Any of those are signs that it's probably time to go ahead and get with a counselor. Okay? But I always want to remind people, we don't have to be a statistic. I talked with one mom who was in the NICU, and the nurse was like, yeah, you're probably going to end up getting divorced. Because even from that very early beginning stages, we're told over and over and over, parents of kids with disabilities, they get divorced, it kills your marriage. And it does not have to be that way. You do not have to be the statistic. You can have the marriage that instead of falling apart is your bedrock to get through this. I had a very good friend that was in a really bad motorcycle accident a while back with her fiance at the time. And she asked me, she's like, can our relationship survive this? Right? This is really, really bad. And I said, you know what? I get how hard things are right now. And also what I know is that I don't think we go to the space where everything's all rosy and perfect and it looks like before everything invaded our world. But I do know that there's a depth that comes from going through fire together. That our relationships can have a depth that they would not have had if we had not faced these same struggles. And we can go through it, and if we're purposeful, we can reach that, and we can have marriages, and we can have relationships that last the long haul and are those supportive connecting spaces. We don't have to be statistics. Right? So I greatly appreciate the chance to get to speak with all of y'all. I really hope that was helpful, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you so much, Lee. This has left us with so much to think about, and I appreciate your time in putting this together. I want to encourage our families to be on the lookout for the next series in our emotional health series, which is going to be exploring how we grieve in different ways at different times along this journey. So Lee will be returning to work with us again for that series as well. So thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you again soon.
Thanks so much.